Get Rich Education is brought to you by Norada Real Estate and Ridge Lending Group.
Welcome to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, giving you information and ideas on the investment that has turned more ordinary people into millionaires and billionaires than anything else, and can provide you with more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Now, here's your host, investor, entrepreneur, business owner, and educator, Keith Weinhold.
Hey, welcome to Get Rich Education, episode 78. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, now heard in 161 world nations. I really appreciate that you're here to create wealth for yourself another week, and you're here because you are an investor. Yes! How could I possibly know that you're an investor? Because we're all investors. In fact, you're investing your time listening to this right now. Well, so what thought patterns are going to make you a successful investor throughout your life? We're going to get into that today because over time, you will change as an investor. What you invested in 5 years ago, that may very well not be what you would choose to invest in today. And what you would choose to invest in today, you know what? You may very well not want to be investing in that in another 5 years, okay? Well, that doesn't mean that you stop investing. In fact, it's just the opposite, because when you're an engaged investor and you close on a deal, that's when you understand it best from the inside, okay? That's when you collapse time frames and migrate to better and higher uses and better and higher investments. And that action taking is exactly where you grow the fastest. So today we're going to talk about changes in your life, your experience, and even changes in the economy that in turn changed your investment decisions. Now, just think about financing a car, all right? When you were a teenager, you thought it was best to pay cash for a car. And then later in life, you thought a loan was better. And today, you may very well want to pay cash again, all right? So what do I mean? Well, just think about yourself, okay? When you were a teenager and you wanted your first car, you wanted to pay cash for the car if you could. That way, you thought if you could pay cash for your first car, that's really smart because you wouldn't have to pay any interest to the bank that way. And you probably thought that all debt was bad too, all right? And, maybe you did pay cash for your first car. Either way, the point is you thought it was smart to pay cash because you weren't paying any interest to the bank and you wanted to own the car free and clear, all right? Then when you were no longer a teenager and you were a little older, you learned that interest rates got really low. And to you, it made more sense to take out, say, a 3% automobile interest loan so that you could instead invest that money at a higher rate than 3%, and then you could pocket the difference. Borrow at 3%, invest at, say, 10%, and that 7% difference is called arbitrage, and you were, to some extent, right there, a successful investor by not paying cash for the car. So there, you just changed as an investor, all right? Additionally, just like I talk about how the return from home equity is exactly zero and always zero. Do you really want to have substantial equity in a car when you can borrow against it so darn inexpensively? Yeah, because the rate of return from car equity is exactly zero, just like it is in a home or in an income property, okay? So you could take a loan, have no equity in a car, and potentially create arbitrage for yourself. Now, today in 2016, 2017, you've still got access to super low auto loan interest rates, which are tempting for you to take advantage of. But now your investor education has expanded some more. And now you've known for quite some time that a recurring automobile loan payment of $500 per month is going to show up to your mortgage loan officer when you apply for a mortgage. We've had income property mortgage loan officers come on to GRE twice now, so you know that a $500 monthly car payment increases your mortgage loan debt to income ratio. So now if you get that auto loan, well, it's harder to get a loan for an income property. So now you figure you'll pay cash for the car. So now you're back to thinking that paying cash for the car is better again. All right. That's because you realize that although you're losing the opportunity of a low rate $40,000 auto loan, you're in turn gaining access to a low rate mortgage loan of, say, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, maybe you can have both, keep an auto loan and still qualify for your next income property. Great. Okay. But if it's one or the other, you'd rather have a low rate $150,000 mortgage loan on a cash flowing income property than a low rate $40,000 auto loan. All right. So again, you've changed as an investor as your awareness expanded. Now, in the future, if mortgage lending standards loosen up so that you can still qualify with a higher DTI, debt to income ratio, then you might be back to wanting an auto loan again rather than paying cash. So both your wherewithal of what's going on in markets and your awareness of opportunity cost, that made you a better investor. You're better informed on a risk-reward basis and a cost-benefit basis inside your own personal economy. Boy, and I mean, understanding trade-offs like this embodies the kind of education advantage that I want to keep giving you with Get Rich Education. Understanding how one debt type is better than the other and positioning yourself accordingly for wealth creation. That's what we're doing here. All right, now how about this? Maybe as an investor, it took you a little while to figure out that the product, that can be one of the least important things when you're investing in a business or when you're investing in real estate. Yes, the product can be the least important thing to consider. All right, just take this for example. Does your mom, does she make the best tamales that you've ever tasted? Let's say that your mom makes the best tamales that you've ever tasted and your friends even like them, okay? She's got successful tamales, a successful product. Now, how successful do you think that it would be if your mom went ahead and opened up her own tamale restaurant? Okay? You see what I mean about the product often being the least important of your investor criteria? All right, a beautiful rental duplex, that could be a great product. That could look tempting to buy. But if it's in a job loss city with no rent-paying tenants in this duplex, with state laws in place where it can take 9 months to evict a tenant once you get a tenant in there, the beautiful-looking rental duplex, that product, that's not what's saving you. That's costing you. Because all the while you're footing the bill for the mortgage, the property taxes, the maintenance, the repairs, the insurance, and everything else, while it's vacant. So a product, that's often the least important thing. All right. When you were a new investor, you didn't know that. Pretty soon, you start to notice that in real estate and in business, the product is down pretty low on the hierarchy of what makes an investment successful. Just look at Marcus Lemonis and his TV show called The Profit on CNBC. Marcus gets inside failing businesses to turn them around, and his mantra is people, process, and product. And it's in that order. First, it's the people, then the process, and finally, the product. When he tries to turn around, say, a failing camper trailer business, first he looks at the abilities and integrities of the people inside that business, then their processes like their trailer manufacturing and their inventory level and their parts suppliers and their distribution system. And only then, after he's looked at people and process, does he take a look at the camper trailer product. Now, as a real estate investor, you're almost conditioned, predisposed as a beginner to think about the product first, the product being that property. Is it a blue fourplex or a yellow single-family income property? Then later, you change as an investor and learn that the market, the neighborhood, the property manager, they're all typically more important than the property, that product. So if you apply people, process, and product, like Marcus Lemonis does on The Profit, if you apply that to cash flowing real estate investing, then think of the people as the market. Okay, are people going there? Are they migrating to that market, or are they leaving there? Is job growth flowing there, that market? Are there more people in terms of population growth in that market? More people is usually, but not always, a result of job growth. Okay, it might be that more people are relocating there because it's a retirement haven that's driving rental demand instead. Okay, that's part of what you do when you do your due diligence in a market. And you've learned that retirement age demographic is increasingly renting rather than buying. So it's the people that ultimately drive the process for that end product, which is your income property. So rather than starting by looking at properties in your local market, which is the way that you first thought about real estate investing, you've changed. You've learned that starting market research at a website like citydata.com or BLS.gov or neighborhoodscout.com, that's a smart top-down approach. Okay, then you've learned that a done-for-you process, again, people, process, and product, a process in a good market like what's offered at noradarealestate.com or midsouthhomebuyers.com, that's what finally leads you to that property. So, look, this can be really simple, all right? Think about it this way. What do you do when you have a flower that doesn't bloom? All right, if you have a flower that's not blooming, what do you fix? You fix the environment in which it grows, all right? You don't fix the flower, okay? That's because the flower is the product. What you do is, say you find a larger plant pot, you put newly fertilized soil in the pot, and then you regularly add water to the flower soil. The people, you, and the process, water and soil, result in the outcome, the product, which is the flower. So the people and the process are more important than the flower, that product. So we're talking about how you're changing as an investor here. When I come back, we're going to talk about how the $15 minimum wage is going to enrich you, yes, you, even as someone that may not work for the minimum wage yourself. This will enrich you. And we're going to talk about other ways that you've changed as an investor, not just inside your mind and how you're thinking, but about how external market forces are changing your mindset as an investor as well. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Cash flow real estate investors, this is Get Rich Education's Keith Weinhold. Did you know that you can finance up to 35 income properties, all with one lender? Ridge Lending Group specializes in investment property loans, and they do it in almost every U.S. state. Ridge has worked with tens of thousands of real estate investors and homeowners all over the country. They've been doing this for investors for so long that at this point, they've helped more families realize their dreams of becoming real estate investors than any other mortgage lender in the country. To find out more, visit ridgelendinggroup.com.
Are you looking for a roadmap to financial freedom? If so, we have a solution for you. Norada Real Estate is offering a limited number of free strategy sessions to help you get out of the rat race. Learn how you can create wealth and build monthly passive income. To set up a time with one of our knowledgeable investment counselors, simply go to noradarealestate.com. That's NORADA realestate.com.
This is David Campbell from Hassle-Free Cash Flow Investing. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold. And don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to GRE. We're talking about how you've changed as an investor over time. And over the break, I was just given this list of stereotypical wealthy sounding names. And this list kind of cracks me up. All right, so here it is real quick before we move on. Some stereotypical wealthy sounding names. Ian Chesterfield. Ian Chesterfield, the first wealthy sounding name. Rudiger Bertram. Rudiger Bertram. Sounds like some old money there for sure with Rudiger. Pierce Van Ryan. Pierce Van Ryan. Sounds like he plays on the polo team there for sure. Aloysius Windermere. Aloysius is not living on the street. No doubt about it. No one ever named Aloysius in the history of the world has lived on the street, I would estimate. Brandon Merriweather. Brandon Merriweather, the next stereotypical wealthy-sounding name. That is a wealthy-sounding name, but I think there's also an NFL player with that name. He plays safety. He started out with the Patriots, I think, and then he's played for some other teams. So, yeah, well, maybe Brandon Merriweather is wealthy if he's an NFL player. Stuart Appleton III. Stuart Appleton III. Sounds kind of like a golfer to me, or definitely the president of the country club, Timothy Gottfried. Okay, Timothy Gottfried. I'd really hate to get called into the executive office of Timothy Gottfried. That sounds intimidating. And the last one here, Lawrence Perrybottom. Lawrence Perrybottom has definitely got to have a house in the Hamptons. Okay, so that's all for the stereotypical wealthy-sounding names. All men on that list for whatever reason. So very nice there. I don't know exactly what the source of that list is. Hopefully someone can get that for me before the show ends. Well, you've been with me as a listener for quite a while, and I really appreciate that. One way you've changed as an investor, if you're more of a beginner, or even if you're somewhat more advanced, is by listening to GRE episodes 10, 20, and 30 of this show, because what I did there was vocab rehab, explaining what common investor terms mean, giving you an example, and then telling you why the term matters to you and how it will increase your wealth. Vocab rehab. You know, a lot of people and educators and shows, they just start to talk over your head, and I just wanted to break down what some of these basic terms mean so that we can move on and learn some things. You're going through seasons as an investor, and the spring season is now firmly here in the United States, so thank you for your listenership during some great shows that we had this winter. I'm based in Anchorage, Alaska. That's where I am today. You've heard me do shows this winter from, can I remember all the places where I did the show from this winter? Usually as I was on a real estate field trip or at a real estate investing conference. I brought you a show from Little Rock, Arkansas, as I did a real estate field trip there. Then after that, I toured Memphis, Tennessee's cash flowing real estate market, and I gave you a report about that. We had the show from where I had the microphone out in the western portion of Panama, where I wrapped up the coffee farm tour there in Central America. And I did 2 shows from Nicaragua. And then I did plenty of shows when I got back home in Anchorage this winter. And this was the 3rd winter in a row where Anchorage got very little snowfall. Most times this winter, there was more grass than snow that was visible in my lawn. Oh, and just dropping back, I did some shows from Miami as well there last month when I was on the Real Estate Guys Investor Summit at Sea. But now spring is firmly here. Villanova won the college men's basketball title the other night. Major League Baseball kicked off their season this week. And I've got a lot of great shows lined up for you this spring. We're talking about how you're changing as an investor. One way you've changed over time is that you've probably figured out that the stock market will not create wealth for you at some point. On a buy and hold basis, it just is not going to create wealth for you, even if it's inside a tax-advantaged vehicle like an IRA or a 401k or a KEO or a 403b or a 457 plan, or any of those other tax advantage plans. Many of them which are just tax deferral plans. And you know what I like to call those? I love calling them instead life deferral plans. When you defer income from when you're younger, you defer your opportunities in life until you're in your 60s or later, when you might not even be able to enjoy life as much as you did when you're younger. In general, tax-advantaged deferred compensation plans are lame. Stocks and stock mutual funds, besides their real rates of return only beating inflation by a little or by nothing over time, their movements are counterintuitive as well. As those markets move, you can't really anticipate what's going to happen, even if you're paying attention to the market, okay? Now, here's what I mean. When you can anticipate market movement in a certain way, you kind of know what to invest in and you know what not to invest in, all right? Just look at the latest monthly jobs report that was just released last week, okay? 215,000 jobs were added to the economy that beat expectations. Well, I mean, totally, that ought to be good news because more employment, that's a positive economic sign for the United States. But you know what? The stock market interpreted that as bad news. Well, why is good news really bad news, which you could not have possibly anticipated? And that's my point. That's because stock investors feared that job growth means that the Fed is in turn more likely to raise interest rates later this year, which can cool an economy that's heating up. On the next monthly jobs report that exceeds expectations, are stock investors going to interpret that good news as good news, or are they going to interpret that good news as bad news? Well, you just don't know. That's my point. You simply have no way of knowing that, all right? So even if you predict the future correctly and anticipate more monthly job growth, it doesn't matter. You don't know if the stock market is going to interpret that as good news or bad news. It's disassociated with reality, and that's why you cannot anticipate that. Well, look, with real estate investing, if there's significant job growth in a certain metro market which exceeds expectations, that's far more likely to directly translate into higher property values for you, higher occupancies in your properties, higher rents in your properties, all at the same time. So your anticipation, your market research, that's more directly correlated. Job growth equals a payoff on your income property. So no wonder that investing in a stock or some subpar mutual fund is just increasingly speculation. Investing in real estate with the strategic approach, that's not speculative. This is investing, not speculation. All right, now last week, California reached a deal on a $15 minimum wage. Higher wages stoke inflation. That is an inflationary act, that raising of the minimum wage. And as a real estate investor with loans on properties, you do want inflation because you stand to profit from a higher minimum wage. Now, as you know, inflation is one of the 5 ways that I talk about as how you're paid as a real estate investor. Just real quickly, first there's appreciation, second there's cash flow, third there's loan pay down made by the tenant, fourth there are tremendous tax advantages, and fifthly, inflation is how you profit when you're a leveraged real estate investor when you buy a property for cash flow when the income exceeds the expenses. Now, I'll explain why you profit from inflation this way when you have a loan, all right? So think about the value of $1 over time, the purchasing power of $1 over the very long term, and imagine that purchasing power being plotted on a graph. Well, that line declines sharply over time. In fact, if a grocery shopper were magically transported from the year 2016 back to the year 1900, the $1 bill that he had in his wallet in 1900, it would now be worth only 3 cents in 2016, okay? So that is $1 in 2016 would have the purchasing power that 3 cents had in 1900. That's another way to say it. So $1,000 would be worth only $30 today. That's a 97% decrease in buying power. So our shopper would consider current dollars virtually worthless. Now here's the takeaway for you. The way that inflation just destroyed your dollar, inflation destroys your debt. That is a huge takeaway. I'll say that again. The way that inflation just destroyed your dollar, inflation will also destroy your debt. So as a real estate investor with loans tied to cash flowing property, you have more good debt than others. Well, inflation destroys your debt over time just the same, and you had all the asset and income benefits on the other side. So with the $15 minimum wage, those higher wages, that promotes that inflation that destroys that dollar, which in turn destroys your debt. So yes, this means that, this $15 minimum wage, it does mean that some lower end jobs are going to be outsourced and some lower end jobs are going to be automated. But overall, the trend of a higher minimum wage is still inflationary. As wages rise, as you think of rising wages at your local fast food restaurant, well, what's the next thing they're going to do when wages rise at your local fast food restaurant? Next, they're going to need to raise prices on their food. And the customers then, in turn, the customers that buy that food, they're going to need higher wages from their own employer eventually to afford the food. And say that customer at the fast food restaurant, say they work a job in some nearby building in a service industry. Well, then that service industry that needed to pay their worker more, well, they're going to have to raise prices on their service clients and on and on. So prices rise. wages rise, asset values rise, including your real estate, and rents rise. Okay, but your mortgage debt amount does not rise. In fact, it gets diluted and eventually destroyed by this inflation at the same time. So the $15 minimum wage, that is a good long-term condition for you as a leveraged real estate investor. Now, politically, you may or may not agree with the $15 minimum wage. Ideologically, you might not agree with it. You know, many argue that the minimum wage should not ever be set at any level at all. I mean, some argue that government intervention in setting wages at all, at any level, is just not capitalistic. This is a force, though, that takes time to trickle through until you're a beneficiary of the inflation. In fact, California's minimum wage will rise gradually, and it's only going to hit the $15 level 6 years from now. New York has a $15 plan in place as well, but this $15 minimum wage movement, it's getting more and more national traction. The fight for 15, as they call it, it has active efforts now, not only in New York and California, but also in Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Washington. So much like the way the Fed manipulates the economy, whether you agree with it or not, it's kind of besides the point. It's about positioning yourself so that it works for you rather than against you. So whether you agree with the $15 minimum wage or not, you've changed as an investor because at some point, and maybe that time was today, you understand how it stokes inflation and obliterates your debt. And as a real estate investor, things tilt toward you being a profiteer. So embrace the $15 minimum wage. It is good for you in an investing sense, whether you like it or not in another sense. At some point, you changed as an investor when you learned that the basic financial model of direct real estate investing is better than stocks, bonds, and some lame, subpar mutual fund. And you realize that this is relatively passive, and it just blew your mind to think that all this, it requires zero formal education. You can get this in a get rich education, all right? You used to think it was great to trade your time for dollars, just to have an opportunity to sell your time for dollars. You used to think that way, to trade away your time for money, But you don't think that way anymore. Like I say, some people get so caught up trying to make a living that they forget to live a life, and that's not a life well lived. You were born rich. Yeah, you actually were born rich because you were born with an abundance of choices. Yes, you were born rich. Now you're just discovering those riches, and you have a choice to either survive or thrive. So when you choose to align yourself with what the Fed is doing and with where the minimum wage is going, I'm not going to say to agree with it or disagree with it, but as an inflationary mandate continues to serve you as a leveraged real estate investor, go ahead and consider aligning your interests accordingly, and you are more likely to thrive than merely survive. You also grew up learning that a penny saved is a penny earned. A penny saved is a penny earned. And you even learned that a penny saved earns another penny, a second penny. Well, that's not true. A penny saved today does not earn a second penny. In fact, that one penny saved just continues to be devalued and debased over time. So as that leveraged real estate investor, you not only have rates of return that far outpace the real rate of inflation, but that very inflation directly benefits you. So that's the real takeaway there. Well, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you told a friend, a relative, or a coworker about Get Rich Education. Some upcoming shows include a guest appearance on how to make what the guests call wheelbarrow profits in real estate investing. And you know what else? Look, you're busy. You could be doing 1,000 things online. So I'm so appreciative when you take a few minutes to write a podcast review on iTunes or elsewhere. If GRE has ever created value for you, a review helps the show's visibility. You can simply Google how to write an iTunes podcast review, or today's show notes have hot links to help you do this too. Until next week, for Get Rich Education's developers, John Collins and Marcus Whelan, sound engineer Vidran Jampo, designer Nikon Roy, I'm your host Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
You've been listening to Get Rich Education, telling you what the wealthy won't tell you about real estate and investing. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to visit iTunes and leave your comments.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.